Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into the exact mechanisms that drive one of the absolute most critical processes in both the brewhouse and the distillery. We're talking about mashing. And you know, mashing isn't just about mixing grain and hot water together. It's really the biochemical foundation of all grain-based fermented and distilled products. Whether you're producing a craft ale, an industrial lager, or a highly specific malt whiskey, mashing is this incredibly precise controlled environment where we transform raw, locked-up starch into fermentable fuel. It's a rigorously governed biological reaction, and mastering it, well, that requires a deep understanding of the physics and biochemistry at play.
Okay, let's quickly map out our mechanistic journey for today. We'll start with the biochemistry of starch conversion, then move into malt enzyme systems, controlling mash conditions, temperature profiles and regimes, and finally, wrap up with wort fermentability and testing.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the biochemistry of starch conversion.
So the primary objective of mashing is breaking down complex starch chains so our biological catalysts can actually go to work. But here's the catch. Before enzymes can even begin to do their thing, we have to physically alter the raw grain. We do this through gelatinization. Think of this as the unwinding of the starch molecule's tightly coiled spiral configuration, and it's driven strictly by heat. In its raw, cold state, starch is virtually impenetrable to enzymes. Heat literally unwinds it. For malt starch, this absolutely crucial unwinding happens between 60 and 65 degrees Celsius, depending on your specific barley variety. Without hitting that thermal threshold, your enzymes simply have no access to their substrate. Period.
Before any enzyme action even kicks off, we really need to look at the physical reality of what we're dealing with. Starch consists of these long chains of sugar, specifically glucose molecules, all linked together. Crucially, though, it's not just one straight, simple line. Notice the significant branches sticking out off the main chain. This highly branched structure is exactly what unwinds during gelatinization, finally exposing those individual links to the environment.
Once that structure is fully unwound, the biological catalysts take over. Notice the distinct attack points on that now exposed starch chain. Alpha amylase makes these random attacks all throughout the chain, breaking it down into smaller, varied pieces with a very high level of activity. It just goes to town. Beta amylase, on the other hand, is highly selective. It methodically shears off highly uniform sugar pairs, specifically at the second-to-last link. Now, maltase is also present in the mix, but it operates with a very low level of activity during this particular phase.
The final result of this targeted enzyme attack is a whole series of fragmented units. And once these broken down units dissolve into your mash water, that liquid officially ceases to be mere water. Boom, you've got wort. This resulting mixture contains various sizes of sugar chains. Now, while most of these fragmented sugars are fully fermentable and totally ready for your yeast to consume, it's really important to note right now that some of those larger unsheared branches, they are not fermentable.
Moving right along to Section 2, malt enzyme systems.
We've seen what actually happens to the starch, but the enzymes released from the crushed malt are highly specific. Their efficiency depends entirely on the environment you provide them. Let's run through the exact optima for each catalyst. Alpha amylase, it peaks at 67 degrees Celsius with a pH of 5.2. Beta amylase actually prefers things just a bit cooler at 62 degrees Celsius and needs a slightly higher pH of 5.25. Looking beyond starch for a second, proteolases operate best at a much lower 50 to 54 degrees Celsius and a pH of 5.5. Meanwhile, beta-glucanase optimally functions at 56 degrees Celsius and a pH of 6.0. The takeaway here is that each distinct system demands a rigorous, specific environment.
Because these optima are all over the place, the amylolytic stand, which is the phase where starch breakdown into those varying complex sugars actually occurs, well, it can't perfectly satisfy both primary enzymes at once. Therefore, setting your mash temperature is inherently a calculated compromise. You're constantly balancing the 67 degrees required by alpha amylase against the 62 degrees preferred by beta amylase, all to achieve the precise, desired level of fermentability for your specific product.
Which brings us perfectly into Section 3, controlling mash conditions.
As process engineers, you're not just passive observers here. You have distinct environmental levers you can pull, but you have to respect the absolute boundaries. Let's look at temperature. If you drop too low, sure, the enzymes survive, but the starch isn't gelatinized, so nothing happens. Push it above 70 degrees Celsius, you permanently inactivate your amylase enzymes. Game over. For pH, your overall optimum is right around 5.4. Drop below 5.0, and those highly acidic conditions literally kill the enzymes. On the flip side, a high pH of 7.0 drastically slows them down. Finally, let's look at time. Anything less than 30 minutes leaves your conversion incomplete.
But going beyond 30 minutes yields absolutely no extra sugar, though it might make the wort slightly more fermentable over time.
Now, you might be wondering, how do we actually actively control that crucial pH lever? Well, this is where water chemistry enters the equation. There's a direct cause and effect relationship between the mineral ions present in your brewing water, specifically calcium, and the reduction of mash acidity. When calcium reacts with the phosphates inherently present in the malt, the chemical byproduct is a crucial reduction in your overall mash pH. That reaction is what moves you down closer to that optimal 5.4 target.
Your fourth lever is water volume, which determines your mash thickness. The physics of thin versus thick mashes vastly alters how efficient your enzymes are. In a very thin mash, enzymes are highly sensitive to heat and will degrade quickly. Plus, the lower concentration of both starch and enzyme means physical contact between the two is just harder to achieve. Conversely, in a thick mash, enzymes are actually surprisingly less sensitive to heat. The concentration is way higher, promoting great contact, but it definitely comes at a physical cost. Thicker mashes have a much higher viscosity, which results in significantly slower sugar extraction, especially when it comes time for wort runoff. Because of this tricky dynamic, the standard optimal range that process engineers aim for is right between 2.5 and 3.5 liters of water per kilogram of dry grist.
All right, moving into Section 4, temperature profiles and regimes. So how do we apply all these biochemical principles to real-world systems? Well, the regime you choose depends almost entirely on the level of malt modification, and this brilliantly illustrates that concept. Take a standard mash profile for an ale. Ale malt is typically very well modified during malting, meaning the cell walls and proteins are already largely broken down. Because of that, it requires only a single saccharification stand, which is that flat line you'd see at roughly 65 degrees to convert the starch. After that, you just do a sharp rise straight to the wort separation temperature.
Now let's contrast that with a rising temperature infusion mash, which is what you'd typically use for a lager. Lager malt is very often undermodified. This means the proteins wrapping around the starch granules haven't been completely broken down yet. If you jump straight to 65 degrees, the starch is shielded, it's protected. So you have to start with a low temperature stand, a proteolytic stand, at around 50 to 54 degrees. This lower temp allows the protease enzymes to break down those proteins and actually release the starch granules well before you step up the heat to begin the saccharification stand.
In both the ale and lager profiles, you probably noticed the aggressive temperature spike at the very end of the process. The deliberate temperature rise to 77 degrees Celsius at the end of the stand serves two strictly mechanical purposes. First, at 77 degrees, you permanently stop any remaining enzymatic activity. That locks in your exact wort fermentability right there. Second, heating the liquid up to this specific temperature really reduces the viscosity of the mash, which significantly improves filtrability in your wort separation system.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, wort fermentability and testing.
Okay, we've pulled all our environmental levers. Now we must look at the actual downstream impacts of those choices. As the enzyme attack creates fragmented units, we get distinct sugars with wildly varying degrees of complexity. A single unit of glucose? That ferments very quickly. A 2-unit maltose ferments quickly as well. Maltotriose, which is a 3-unit sugar, will eventually be fermented by yeast, but it's going to happen slowly. And finally, a dextrin, with its complex branch structure, simply won't ferment at all.
At the end of your saccharification process, you absolutely must chemically validate that your enzymes have actually done their job and no unconverted starch remains. We do this via the iodine check. The absolute key here, and honestly a step that gets rushed way too often, is that the sample must be cold. The specific coloration reaction we're looking for only occurs in a cold mash. So you take this cooled sample, you apply a drop of a 0.02 normal iodine solution tincture, and what you are looking for is the total absence of a dark blue or black coloration. If that yellowish iodine turns dark blue or black, it explicitly indicates that you still got unconverted starch or higher dextrins floating around in there.
Ultimately, everything we've covered today points right back to this fundamental truth from the literature. The range of sugars produced during conversion determines the fermentability of the wort. It's that simple. If your enzyme attack is complete, the wort is highly fermentable. If it's incomplete, it's only partially fermentable. Mastering these biochemical and physical levers, the exact temperature, the pH, the mash thickness, is what dictates the exact nature of your downstream product, whether you're making beer or distilling spirits.
So, as you head back out to the brew house or the distillery floor today, I want you to consider this. If your optimal mash parameters shift by just a few degrees, or if your calcium levels drop your pH by just a couple of points, how will that alter the delicate compromise of your very next starch conversion?
The science here is incredibly rigorous, and the margins are incredibly tight. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.